Dave, we are very honored to have a guest from Arizona State University. And this event today is co-sponsored with Archie. So thank you so much for doing that. And I will allow our guest, and I'm afraid to pronounce your name because I know I will mispronounce it. I will allow you to introduce yourself, and maybe at the end, if we have more questions, we can stay around and answer them. But we will take our questions at the very end. And for the folks joining us online, please put your questions in the chat and we will get to them. We have lunch here in this room, so please feel free to grab some food. And with that, we will get started. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
So hi everyone, my name is Huê-Tâm Jamme, if anyone wants to practice the pronunciation. But yeah, I'm an assistant professor of urban planning at Arizona State University. I joined in 2020 after I finished my PhD in urban planning at the University of Southern California. Originally, my background is in political science. And I came to urban planning after 5-6 years of doing urban planning consulting in Vietnam. So today I'm going to present some work that is actually more like centered in the US. I'm going to talk about the commute, the role of the commute. I do work quite a bit in the transportation space, but what I'm really interested in is like transportation as part of like broader systems, like broader as a defining feature of urbanism. So I'm going to talk about the long-term impacts and behavioral roots of US car dependence. This work is really in this part of my research agenda, which I define as like, the notion of mobility transition. So, which is all about the societal transformations associated with a shift from one system of mobility, including infrastructure, habits, norms, culture, and economic factors, structural factors associated with a dominant mode of transportation. So mobility transitions are really about studying the societal transformations associated with a shift from one system to another. And that's like really a central piece of my research agenda, where a lot of my work is actually at the intersection of three like research interests. Another one is like I'm also looking at transformations of public space associated with mobility transitions and the role of like the rise of the digital economy in that picture. So that's what I'm looking at more broadly. And I guess kind of like a signature piece of my scholarship so far has been my work on productive friction, which is really a central mechanism at the core that kind of like brings these three things together. I have defined productive friction as the opportunities for social interactions that are like really shaped by our movement through the built environment.
Sorry, we're sharing the screen.
I pressed the camera. Let me illustrate this real quick. So for that, I will take you very briefly to Vietnam, where that work all started, and then we'll come back to the US. This is like, I'll often return to this picture because this was my first time really capturing on the picture what I wanted to document, this notion of productive friction, which is, again, this opportunity for a social interaction. So here we're talking about different types of interactions. We're seeing someone who's, just because of the vehicle she drives in the context of Vietnam, is more like higher, like upper middle class, who's probably on her way from between an origin and a destination, and who on her way, we suspect, kind of made a spontaneous stop to buy a towel from a street vendor. This was captured in 2015 in Ho Chi Minh City at a time when 90% of all trips were made by motorbikes, these vehicles that you see here on the street. And this was a time where automobile use was skyrocketing in Vietnam. Now it's like, now it has increased a lot already in like just 10 years. And at the time, I was really interested in documenting. So this is, this interaction is what I call productive friction, because the fact that this transportation experience was rubbing like against, you know, like all the activities that are happening on the side of the road. This is like kind of this rubbing of the flow with the built environment that made that whole interaction we have here on picture possible. It's not the mode alone. Like she could have done the same on a bicycle. It's not the built environment itself. It's not the fact that this guy is here, but it's really the interaction of the two, the movement and the built environment. And why does this matter? At the time, I was really puzzled by, like, you know, a question of what will happen when this lady will start driving, as many of, you know, upper middle class folks there are aspiring to, for very good reasons. They want their kids to be safe in transportation. They're tired of, you know, inhaling the exhaust fumes of motorbikes in traffic. For all sorts of reasons, they are really attracted to the car. But I was starting to think, you know, what will happen to the street vendor who currently lives off the connection to the street? Will this person continue to buy towels in a very spontaneous way like she did at that one time? Probably not. So productive friction has implications for livelihoods. More broadly for economic development, people in the retail sector, including street vendors in Vietnam at the time, were like 30% of the workforce. It has implications for accessibility and quality of life more generally, how convenient transportation and shopping and all of that is for individuals. And overall, it has implications for the public life of street spaces. And then I moved to the US. And the situation is, as you all know, radically different. We are more like in the situation here in Arizona where 90% of all trips are made by car. But this whole question of mobility transitions, when I started getting interested in what happens locally, efforts at promoting more flexible modes of transportation and so on, kind of similar questions continue to interest me. Really thinking about how does the current transportation system shape social spatial relations today? And if we were to transition to a completely new, different, radically different system, what would happen? Like what benefits, what would people gain from it? And what would, you know, the broader social life maybe lose or gain from it? And also in general, like why are people interested or not interested in adopting a whole new system of transportation? So this is how from my original work that was really motivated by the rise of car use in a very different context, I kind of like broadened my research agenda to think along within a similar framework about US car dependence and the possibility of transitioning to another system. Three major questions, kind of like overarching question in my research agenda, continue to shape my research agenda, which I have listed here. And today I want to illustrate, you know, like the different things I've been doing, involved in here in Arizona and the US more broadly, that kind of speak to these big questions. I start with, this is an Arches supported lecture. I'll start with an Arches project that I've been co-leading for the past 2 years now, about the role of housing and transportation in shaping long-term social relations, focusing on racial inequalities in Phoenix. Then I'll be talking a little bit, like touching really briefly on this question of like, why would some people be interested in transitioning in this case? Looking at the case study of people interested in living at cul-de-sac in Tempe, like often branded as the very first car-free neighborhood built from scratch in the US. And I'll be talking about like just giving you a glimpse of key findings from a national survey that we conducted at ASU and US car dependence. Before I get into, you know, the empirics, I want to give a little bit of like a conceptual framework to all of that. And my approach to this question of mobility transitions is quite infused with Amartya Sen's capability approach, which originally like starting from work thinking about inequality and kind of like contesting, challenging a very utilitarian perspective on inequality, thinking about it's maybe not so much, you know, like the very utilitarian outcomes we typically measure, say income inequality. Maybe that's not really what matters. Maybe what matters is people, like the inequality of people's capabilities and capabilities of, you know, achieving what then he described later in his like a groundbreaking book for development studies, Development as Freedom, capabilities of achieving the life that people really value. So development from this perspective is a matter of human development and really thinking about expanding people's capability and inequalities of capabilities between individuals based on what they really want in life and what their personal needs are relative to what they can achieve. From this perspective, the capability approach is quite often used in, more and more often used in transportation justice studies. And recently, a recent review on the notion of car dependence actually defined car dependence as a matter of being incapable of living, accessing the places that people need and want to access, and basically being limited in their ability to participate in location-based activities. And that takes the whole conversation on car dependence kind of away from broader societal goals of sustainability. It is about equity indirectly, but really it brings it to the individual level about, the transportation mode you use at the end of the day has to be practical and has to support the life that we really want to have. And that perspective really infuses all of the work that I do about mobility and mobility transition. So first study, the role of housing and transportation in racial inequalities in Phoenix, Arizona. So this is a housing study led by two people who are not housing scholars, including my collaborator, Dylan Connor, who for the last few years has been working really about economic social mobility and inequalities. He's an inequality scholar, a geographer, and myself, who is definitely more in the transportation and public space area. We've been assisted by wonderful research assistants with really cool pictures, much cooler than ours on this slide. In this research, again, informed by this notion of capabilities and this notion that, capabilities are not just about income, but about having the resources to enhance your capabilities, where income is just one piece among others. Education is another, gender equality is another, and so on. We are looking at what you could call maybe two meta resources for a good capability, for expansion of your capabilities or a good quality of life overall. Those meta resources are financial wealth and time wealth. There's a whole lot of research that is showing that these two meta resources, or the lack thereof, are really essential for, has really detrimental, the lack of wealth of both types has really detrimental effects on many aspects of people's lives, like their health, their kids' educational outcomes, social isolation, quality of life, and so on. So from this perspective and this project, we asked two questions. One is, how have wealth and time inequalities evolved since 2000 through the Great Recession and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic? And how do housing and transportation shape these inequalities or explain these inequalities? Our conceptual framework is the following. Our starting point is that presidential choices often involve trade-offs between housing and transportation costs. Some people will prefer to rent a house close to work to minimize their commuting time. Others will prefer to buy further away. These two aspects of which are all about building wealth and managing your time are very influential in defining where people live. We know that residential location obviously predicts home values, while home values and tenure are the main determinants of wealth. But residential location also predicts the time that people spend traveling, especially traveling every day to their workplace. So that makes commuting time also a key, it makes it a key determinant of discretionary time. So our hypotheses are that housing is directly linked to wealth inequality, especially through tenure and location, and transportation is directly linked to time inequality, also through location and through commuting times. We conduct our analysis in Phoenix. we examine racial inequality between whites, non-Hispanic whites, and Hispanic non-whites. We choose to focus on these groups because they are the largest groups in the area. And also the minority group, Hispanic non-white, have non-negligible shares of homeownership. But there are certain social and spatial inequalities that separate these two groups. First, they live in very different areas. So what you have here on the screen is the concentration of white people, especially in the northwestern part of the metropolitan area, as opposed to Hispanic non-white folks living more concentrated in the northeast southwest. Second, even if the maps on the right, which are showing wealth disparities, they show similar patterns of spatial concentration of wealth for both groups. Rich Hispanics are located in the same, concentrated in the same areas as rich white people, but we're actually talking about very different levels of wealth. Just if you look at the range, like the top bracket, we're talking about very different levels of wealth between the two groups. We built a data set using ACS data to compute a very simple measure of post-contracted time. So that's like to get at our measure of time wealth. Post-contracted time, we use like a really coarse measure that's like you take the total number of hours that you take 24 hours from which you subtract the time we subtract for everyone 8.5 hours for personal care, including sleep, worked hours, and the commuting time. And what is left, you can assume, is the time that an individual has to perform all household duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and engage in leisure. We have 3 ways of ACS data, and we did this computation for all household heads. So the analysis I'm showing today is at the household head level. Household heads age 21 through 64, and that's like more than 52,000 observations. Financial wealth, we measured it, actually we extracted directly measurements of household wealth from GeoWealth US, which is a new data set that my collaborator Dylan Connor has been contributed to build. Up until his team published this paper in 2024, there were no spatial estimates of wealth inequality in the nationwide. So how did they build this data set? They used a gold standard survey that the US has, probably apparently the best wealth survey that exists in the world. It's called a Survey of Consumer Finances. And actually it has data only for the Atlanta region where the Federal Reserve is. But there are a lot of variables that overlap between the survey, the SCF survey, and the ACS data in the census. So what they did is they built a machine learning model that learns the relationship between these variables, so including home ownership, different source of income, from employment, from investment, and so on. And they built a machine learning model that looks at the relationship between these variables and wealth in the SCF data. And then they use these same variables to make predictions of household wealth profiles across the country. They made these predictions for all public use microdata from 1960 to 2023. Our regression framework is quite simple. What we're looking at is like for individual household heads, we observe them cross-sectionally in period T. We don't have longitudinal data. We just have 3 cross-sections, basically. We're interested in their net worth or household wealth and their post-contracted time. And really what we're interested in is this racial gap here in red. This racial gap, so this racial gap is all about, like time trend and base level differences between the two groups. That's like our quantity of interest. Then we have a set of basic controls, like for age, sex, employment, education, And finally, what we're really interested in are these controls that are more about like the structural factors that we're thinking about, like homeownership, tenure, commuting time, and a variable that's like more and more impactful, right? Like work from home. So what this framework allows us to do is first, it allows us to measure how large the racial gaps are in general. And then it allows us, by including the controls, like these sets of controls, one after the other, it allows us to see like how much of the gap is explained by these controls. So let's look at the trends real quick. Here, I'm showing you the results, like the predictive margins from a regression specification where we just control for the basic controls. So age, sex, college status, and employment status. So this is just measuring the racial gaps, the racial wealth gap between whites and Hispanic non-whites. We see that in 2000, the difference is 212,000 US dollars. What the times 2.34 means is that for every $1 that a Hispanic household holds, a white household holds on average $2.34. In 2012, after the recession, mainly because of the particular drop in Hispanic household wealth, that ratio increased to 2.88. And in 2022, we see that the ratio kind of shrank a little, but the net difference is basically the same as it was in the original period, about 200K. So what we learn from this figure is that the wealth gap seems highly resilient over time, even through these periods of shock. This is the time inequality trend. So predicted margins again, but a very different picture. We see that in 2000, white household heads actually had 32 minutes less per week. This is a weekly measurement per week than Hispanic household heads. After 2010, that goes up to 149 minutes. And what we think is really interesting is like how, the point estimates are really close to each other in 2020. So actually it's 2022. Every time you see 2020 here, that's a mistake. In 2022, the point estimates are really close. But what we find really interesting is that the trend, like the trajectory suggests that Hispanic household heads are like gaining time, are losing time into the future, whereas white household heads seems to be recovering time. So these are like the time and wealth inequality trends. But now let's look at the mechanisms. So here we're taking a first pass at trying to explain the racial wealth gap. We're not explaining like differences in trajectories. We're really explaining the difference in the average gap across the series. But when we add the controls that we're really interested in, right? Like the role of home ownership, not home values, just like whether people own a home or not, and how long they've lived in it, the gap that we observed earlier shrinks by 20%. This is to say that home ownership and tenure alone explain 20% of the wealth gap that we observed, that we saw earlier. And then if we add the location, that difference increases to 67 percentage points. So yeah, what we see is something like 67% of the racial wealth gap is explained by all of these things together, whether people own a house, how long they've lived in it, and where it's located. Now let's do the same for the racial time gap that we observed earlier. We stated that the gaps, we stated that the gap seems to be like to the advantage of Hispanic household, who seem to have like more time than white household heads across the period, but with a declining trend, as we mentioned. But actually, when we start like looking at like the decomposition of this gap, what we're seeing is like in terms of commuting over time, whites seem to be wasting less and less time commuting relative to Hispanics. So the minus 42 that you see here means that whites are commuting 42 minutes less than Hispanics. Of course, here this is excluding people who work from home. This is accounted for in this column. So of all the people who commute, whites commute for 42 minutes less than Hispanics. In terms of working hours, whites are actually working slightly longer. So 0.8 hour per week. It was 0.7, even at 2.7, even at some point. What we find like really interesting here is that this relative disadvantage in post-contracted time for white people seem to be due to more time spent productively, which eventually might fuel the wealth gap that we talked about earlier. And in terms of work from home percentages, the differences are very large. What you see in this last column to the right are percentage point differences. So in 2000, it was something like 4% of white household heads work from home and 1% Hispanic household heads. So a 3 percentage point difference. By 2010, it was a 5 percentage point difference, and by 2022, a 12 percentage point difference. So this slide is like really a summary of our the key findings from this Archie's study. What we find is that the racial wealth gap seems extremely resilient over time, and it is very closely tied. Unsurprisingly, I think that part of our findings is definitely not the most surprising one, but definitely closely tied to housing, home ownership, and location, which of course, like, you know, this was the whole premise, but are like so central to it's such a defining feature of household wealth. I think the racial time gap finding might be a little bit like more promising. It's kind of, we see it changing rapidly, definitely largely driven by commuting time and work from home trends. Overall, we learned from this study that housing and transportation seem to be like a hinge point of wealth and time inequality. And you know, two reasons why we think it's interesting to think about wealth and time inequality. One is wealth in general is like we have with this new data set, it is synthetic data, but it's our first opportunity to really measure a critical variable, which is wealth, which many studies that have been using this data over the last 2 years are showing that in many ways it's much more influential than income inequality. So we are using that measure of wealth for the first time in housing and transportation studies. And when it comes to time, like time wealth, like thinking about, you know, discretionary time as being really critical for a high quality of life, that's kind of like considered by some transportation researchers, but as an overlooked dimension of transportation research. There are limitations to this study. The fact that we're looking at, you know, the individual level, like the household head, that's something we need to, these are like the final steps of our study, move to the household level, because we think that those decisions on, you know, where to live and how to split the time, those decisions are made at the household level. Our post-contracted time measure is rather coarse, but we don't really have, like, we can't really use time use survey data, which would really help us get that more, you know, refined measures of discretionary time, because there's no spatial, it's not spatial. But yeah, we're working around these things, and this is where we're at in the research. Now, before I transition to the second part of my talk, I want to connect these findings to this big picture I started from about US car dependence. It might feel like a stretch. It is a little bit of a stretch. I was invited if I wanted to connect, you know, this piece of work with like all the work I do on US car dependence. But I don't think it's that big of a stretch in the sense that, you know, we're not talking about specific modes here, but we're talking about Phoenix. It's quite reasonable to assume that most people, when it comes to, you know, their commuting time, most people and the role of commuting time, shaping discretionary time and so on, most people drive. And if they don't drive, they probably waste even more time in transportation if they're transit dependent, say. And in Phoenix, we also know what the trade-offs are, when it comes to like home location, home values, and so on. A lot of people who choose home ownership end up living in suburbs. So we can assume, that this commuting piece that we have here in this study, when, how I was talking about transportation systems, definitely the commuting piece is really strongly, like closely entangled with how people live, where they live, how they live, and what type of housing and how much it's worth, and where they work. It's all related. So that piece is part of the bigger transportation system as I defined it earlier, really as like shaping a set of social and spatial relations. So this study, I see it as, like very early evidence that a transportation system, which is not just about how people move around, but also like how it's closely linked to, again, where they live, where they work, and so on, has like long-term impacts on social relations. And here we were looking at one type of relations in particular, like racial inequalities in terms of wealth and time gaps. Let's move into the second study, which is really getting at the question of like, why would some people even be interested in experiencing a radically different system? So why are some Americans interested in car-free living, in a car-free neighborhood? This is work, like everything I'll be presenting from now on, is work I've been co-leading with my colleague Deborah Salmon, associate professor in our school, and 1, 2, 3, 4 PhD and actually undergraduate students who have been assisted and also leading some of the research I'll be presenting. But very briefly, now I'm only giving you snapshots of results. That one study, titled "Why Are Some Americans Interested in Car-Free Living?" is all based on a survey, interviews, and focus groups with prospective residents at cul-de-sac Tempe. So you might have heard about this neighborhood, which is often described in the news as the first neighborhood built, car-free neighborhood, intentionally car-free, built from scratch. Joe is one of the prospective residents we talked to in 2021. At the time, cul-de-sac was just breaking ground, so not constructed yet. But he was on the waiting list to be one of the first residents. He's an elderly man who moved from the northwestern United States to Arizona to like not have to deal with the rain anymore, who loves to bike, but who always had a car, and at the time still had a car, but was like, I'm not unready. I'm actually very much looking forward to living there. And our question, and he wasn't alone, 502 people were on that mailing list. So this was our population of interest, and they were waiting to move in. So cul-de-sac Tempe, first car-free neighborhood built from scratch in the US, that's there from their website. We're talking about 17 acres. Some of us have visited it as like an Arches event, that field visit. We're talking about 700 and plus apartments. It's still under construction. It's like in the second phase of development. By the time upon completion, they're expected to have about 1,000 residents. The groundbreaking feature of cul-de-sac is there's zero parking for residents. Instead of parking, they're providing, well, because they don't have to accommodate for parking, they could be much more playful with the architecture. So you have like, it's not just 90-degree angles, it's like a bit different. Instead of parking, they're providing ample open space, including private courtyards between buildings, ground floor retail, like relatively large park, and they're providing residents with a mobility package. So as part of their rent, residents have like a free transit pass, and there are like shared scooters and shared electric vehicles on site, and they have access to mobility perks of this site. Cul-de-sac Tempe has made international news because of its groundbreaking parking policy, but what makes that policy especially groundbreaking is the context, of course. We're talking about Tempe, Arizona, one of the most car-centric regions in the world. So we did conduct a survey with these 502 residents. We got 108 responses. Of all of our participants, 66% had already signed a lease, which is a sign of like strong commitment to adopting a car-free lifestyle. 20% were just depositees. They had deposited $100 to be one of the first residents, and 14% were interested but not like as committed yet. We conducted focus groups with 15 of these participants and in-depth interviews with 7 of them. And I want to emphasize one key finding from this study. When we asked about their motivations to live there, the main one that came across really strongly was a matter of social connectedness. Their original motivation to radically change their lifestyles, most of them were regular drivers. They have like different attitudes. They probably like sustainable transportation modes more than average Americans, but they own cars as in an equal measure. And they drive them a little bit less often, but they mostly depend on their cars. But they feel isolated. One thing they had in common is like a sense of like, we're so disconnected from especially our neighbors, but more generally, it's a very isolating way of life that we have. They come from all over the country, by the way, and our respondents were very explicit in blaming this sense of isolation on car-centric urbanism. They would be like, and both people who live in large apartment buildings or people who live in suburbs, in different ways, they both feel isolated. Some of them who live in large apartment buildings would be like, we're just walking to our cars in the basement, parking garage, and then we're driving to wherever we're going. The only thing we have in common is the hallway, which would rarely cross paths. And people who go home in the suburbs are like talking about their neighbors, saying they go into their driveways and the garage door shuts and we never see them. So one thing that really attracts them to this whole new model way of living is really having one thing in common that is not like a defining feature, like as strong a personal, identifier as a gender identity or a cultural, ethnic background. It's like we live car-free, but it doesn't mean that we have everything in common. Actually, our respondents were like, one concern that they shared was, I hope there would be diversity there. And they were themselves a very diverse group. But yeah, again, I'm emphasizing the social connectedness piece here. That's all in the paper, like who they are and so on. But they think about living in a car-free environment and thinking about everyone will be car-free, meaning that we'll at least encounter people, between our apartment to the train station stop. We will probably cross paths with someone, and just being able to nod at a neighbor without having to get involved in a more, engaged interaction. That's really what they're looking for. They're looking for productive friction, if you want my opinion. So yeah. So one of them was like, well, life may be a bit more fulfilling in that way. You don't feel alone because there's people there. That's really what they're looking for. So just like a summary figure we have in the paper, the social interaction piece that comes across as a really strong motivation, along with, if we're in a very supportive environment, it might actually be convenient and less costly. And car freedom, they see car freedom as like, being free from the burdens of car ownership. Pioneering a new lifestyle, like thinking, well, maybe the rest of America could follow, is another motivation. But the whole piece, like really the land use and transportation piece is really not, they talk about it a lot, but more as instrumental to achieving this. It's really, And all of these, what in the literature on like mobility, like moving to a more sustainable transportation, all of these broader societal outcomes is really not like on top of their mind. At the end of the day, it has to be convenient and practical, and anyway, real quick, I want to finish on like highlights from work we've been doing based on a national survey on US car dependence and interest in car-free living across the country. So what we have seen among, a very highly self-selected group of people who want to move to cul-de-sac, we actually went to measure across the nation how many people are interested in car-free living and who are they. And then we learned other things from that survey that I'll share very briefly. So that survey, 200 and more than 2,000, people living in cities and suburbs. So we excluded rural folks because for them, car-free living is just not an option. And that sample is weighted as per the 2020 census, so probably representative of that population of urban and suburban Americans. The survey was all about really motivated by that question of who's interested in car-free living. And we also had questions about life satisfaction and social interaction. This is the key finding I wanted to show you. How many people are interested? We find that a really non-negligible share of people, of urban and suburban US residents, 18%, that's almost 1 in 5 Americans, say they are definitely interested in car-free living. That is much more than, the only 10% of people who currently do it. And we know from the literature that people who currently do it, 10% of the population, they are carless. They're not car-free. It's not by choice, typically. It's by necessity that people don't drive. So we find that 18% of Americans would choose that lifestyle if available near them. That's how the question was worded. We actually had a little primer in the survey describing, hey, there's a neighborhood. We did kind of describe cul-de-sac. If that were available near you, would you be interested? 18% said yes, and an additional 40% said maybe. We really did not expect the share to be so large. Another thing we did not expect is we find here a very diverse group. Actually, all the things that are significant in defining who's carless, especially income level, so carless folks, typically low income. Racial ethnic minorities more represented in the carless group. All these demographic factors were not statistically significant in explaining who is interested in living car-free. One factor that was really strongly significant, however, was whether people had the experience in the past. Having had the experience was a strong predictor of being interested in car-free living. A second study that we conducted based on the same data set actually looked at one type of experience that people had in the past, which is whether people did use a sustainable mode, basically any mode other than the car, when they were in 5th grade. We did ask people, our respondents, how did you go to school when you were in 5th grade? And then we separated our sample between those who were driven, exclusively driven, and those who use a sustainable mode, basically any other mode, including the school bus, at least sometimes. And we find that all else being equal, having used a sustainable mode to school when you were in 5th grade reduces by 12 percentage points the probability of being a car-dependent adult. Well, by car-dependent here, we're talking about really, really car-dependent, like doing more than 95% of all your trips by car. So it reduces the probability by 12 percentage points. And wait, that transfers across generations. We also find that it increases by 31 percentage points the probability that you choose a sustainable mode for your children, grade school children. So the importance, the role of experience really comes across really strongly in that one study. Finally, another finding based on the same data set in another paper, we do have evidence that actually car dependence, extreme levels of car dependence, once we pass the 50% and more of the trips, is negatively related with life satisfaction. The relationship is positive up to a point. Obviously, being able to drive in the US is a matter of being able to access the places where you might want and need to go. So positive relationship up to a point, and then the relationship declines. Then we have like exactly the same figure with exactly the same shape, regardless of how we measure car dependence. So I'm showing you two here, share of car trips weekly car mileage, and we have another measure of subjective car dependence, which shows exactly the same trend. Let me conclude here. I've put all of these findings together under this whole umbrella of like thinking about mobility transitions as transitioning to a new form, a new model of society, where transportation is an instrumental piece. So the whole premise is that the way we move around is just really closely entangled with how and where we live, we work, we shop, and we socialize. I did mention that there's kind of this underlying, like overarching question of like how does the transportation system is related to social spatial relations. The project that did include into a housing, Arches housing project, include a commuting piece, ends up like shedding a light on, long-term impacts of commuting times on the racial time gap in particular. The studies I showed you about interest in car-free living, which is, related to my second overarching question, which is all about why would some people be interested or not interested in like completely radically changing their lifestyles and, if possible, the system they're in. We have learned that most Americans, that's kind of how we see it, based on the findings about the sustainable school travel piece. Those who did not use one of these, like most kids who are driven to school, it's kind of like using anything else later in life. It's just not really part of the choice set. People were kind of like have learned to rely on cars since they were kids, and unless they have learned something else or they have been exposed to something else, like the folks interested in living at cul-de-sac who traveled abroad at some point, or you had some, college experience on a really walkable campus. Unless people have had these exposures, it's like doing anything else than driving is not really an option. That's kind of how we see it. And yet we learned that there's a sizable demand for car-free living. Like 18% is really not, it's quite significant. And individual benefits, we have evidence of like a positive relationship with better quality of life overall. One lifestyle that has rooted also in more social interaction, at least that's what people expect. What does this mean for planning, for architects moving forward? I think the goal really should be, if we want to promote a sustainable mobility transition in this country, I think lowering the expectation, but making them really close to what people really care about, which is being capable, like, the opposite of the definition of car dependence I showed you earlier. Being capable of participating in all the activities, occasion-based activities you might want or need to participate without a car, making it possible, making it a satisfying lifestyle. I think that really is what matters. How to achieve that? The cul-de-sac case study really is, the low-hanging fruit, but it's hard. Politically, it's hard, but lower parking minimums, for sure. There's demand for it. Cul-de-sac is still talked about as like this experiment by a really, a startup that's taking a huge risk. We have evidence that there's demand for it out there. So maybe make it, build those car-free neighborhoods and definitely supported. They need to be supported by reliable multimodal public transit, multimodal alternatives. Safe, sustainable school travel options like early life exposure as much as possible. We know that matters, plus 31 percentage point, right? Probability that the next generation might pick it up and avoid car dependence. That would be great. And for developers themselves and architects, like those car-free environments, what differs in the model that people interested in living at cul-de-sac, they're not there. Some of them are already living in multifamily mixed-use buildings, but they're like, that's different. It's not like intentionally designed for people to cross paths. So creating space for social interaction seems important. And in response to this concern about how diverse will that community be, we know that people interested in car-free living are actually quite diverse. So it means a diversity of segments of the population to cater for with potentially more car-free developments, more family-friendly developments, options to own, which right now don't exist. Thank you very much. Very happy to take questions. Yeah, can you?
It's for the wonderful way the title that puts together. I was curious about the racial time gap. If you might know anything more about how people report it for that good time. As part of that, is it self-reported or is there are they describing what type of work that they're doing as well?
It's really, like I say, it's a very close measure. It's really number of work hours. Yeah, that's all we have. Well, we have information about their job, but we're not really using it. I think ACS has information about what type of job they have, but we're not using it in this study. Yeah. So we just have like number of work hours, which we have subtracted from a day.
Yeah, also, thank you, wonderful projects that you've been done. I have a question on your first one, what like struck me as most kind of at least visually notable were like the differences in 2010. And I'm curious like whether you thought about like 2010, I'm guessing you're picking up on like a lot of, you know, Great Recession distortions to housing wealth and then also distortions to employment. And like whether or not those things, like you could pick up maybe like divergence in racial responses to the Great Recession and also kind of how people recovered afterwards, right? So that, you know, I lost my job, so my commute went down to 0, and then I found a new job that was farther away versus I lost my house and now I'm farther away from my job. Like those kind of like differences within the data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. But I mean, I feel like that's kind of like, you know, when we say our key finding here is like in terms of wealth, because that's what we're measuring here. The wealth gap is highly resilient. It's like the difference across periods, like both groups experience the recession. It seems like from the perspective of like how much wealth they hold, it seems like both groups experience the same drop, actually, you know, like same trend, but the gap remained exactly the same.
But then on like the next one don't you see more of a difference on?
Oh, for sure. On the time gap, we see a big difference. And we definitely, that's totally something we could, we should like dive into more. Like definitely the 149 minutes, it must be because Hispanic household like heads have probably lost their jobs more than white household heads. So it must be it. It's not good news, you know, like when we first see it, it seems like it could seem from, if you look at it from the same perspective, like an advantage, you know, to be much higher. But it's really not good news if it means people are like just at home because they have no job.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really something totally, we should probably tease it out because we do have that information.
It looks like we have questions online.
Yes, one question from Jennifer Merrill. The survey participants didn't seem to include many parents, approximately 150 out of 2,000. Does this reflect the proportion of adults with children in the area? It would be interesting to see how the results vary depending on the number and ages of children.
Yeah, totally. And that's definitely that's the main limitation of that one study. We have like a small sample size of parents. The reason is, I guess, I mean, it's really representative of like how many parents have children in that age bracket. We asked specifically, let's say that this whole survey was about much more than this. And I saw it, I had done work in the past about like the experience of children walking to school and so on. And I was quite familiar with this literature, and I was always like puzzled by the fact that a big chunk of that literature is about the determinants of whether children walk or bike to school, and that factor that we tease out here, like which is the mode that parents use themselves, was never in the set of factors. So I was like, I have my opportunity to ask, because we didn't want the question to be so long. So the respondents were like asked, do you have children? And like, if you have, like, I forgot how we did ask them like, what mode did you use to school when you were in 5th grade? And then when comes the question about how many children do you have, they were giving us numbers by age bracket. And then we asked for the youngest one of your children in that age bracket, like what mode do they use? We didn't want to start asking about all of the modes for all of the children. It would have made our survey instrument too lengthy. But if we had like designed the survey to be specifically about that, we would definitely have aimed for, like, first of all, we would have surveyed parents and not just adults, you know. And so, yeah, that's definitely the main weakness of the main limitation of that study.
So to clarify on the second piece, when you're asking what mode you take, it's the children are driven and then everything.
I know we did ask them specifically. Yeah, and so that's like, you know, that's the main limitation of the study, but at the same time, the fact that we find such a strong effect despite this limitation kind of gives us confidence that something is going on there. And also we did conduct the study, that's all available for anyone who would want to see it. But we looked at, you know, one-on-one relationships, like whether people walk, how it relates to whether their children walk, the role of bicycling. The only one we can't do is public transit because too few people use that or have children who use that. But we do it like mode by mode, and it's the relationship holds for all modes. Bicycling is the strongest one. But yeah, but for the in that paper we lumped them together.
I have a question about the Woodstock neighborhood. So people had this wonderful expectations, but did you talk to those people after they moved in to see if they, you know, the place met their expectations?
So that was the goal, you know, originally all that I have presented here is based on we received a small like seed grant from ASU to pilot this study, and our goal was to have the pre-move data and then hopefully get funded for a post-move study, which we never got funded for. So far, this is still up in the air. We know that some of these folks do live there. We have interviewed 2 of them, but that's really not enough and not big enough of a sample to learn any lessons from it. The one guy, which actually is Joe, that we interviewed, again, of course, it's not easy. I was very happy with how much social interaction he has now. But yet, again, any problem.
So one final question online. Elena Richards asked, were there any follow-up questions for the maybes in the survey about what factors were important to the willingness to be interested in car-free living? If yes, what factors were most important by race?
Thank you so much for helping design our follow-up study. That's really where we want to go. Like now we're really interested in like, what does it take for people to turn interest into action? And we have some, you know, cues here and there, like, yeah, but it would be really nice and important to figure that out.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.